Okay, guys, can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so if anyone has their mics on, then please mute it. Same for video, just because we're currently at like 80 people, so that's going to be insane if everyone starts talking. But the group chat, if you don't know how to get to the chat window, in the gray bar there should be a thing with 3 dots where it says more, and then at the top of that there should be a thing that says chat. So that will take you to the chat window, and from there you can ask questions or whatever. So this will be me talking. I'm here with Mike Clancy, the assistant anatomy instructor at the Barcelona Academy of Art.
Hi guys.
So Mike's mic will be on, but for everyone else, yeah, if you could keep your mics off. Joseph, could you turn your video off just so we don't want to make it slower for everyone. And I'm going to give it just a couple of minutes just for anyone coming late, and then we're going to start. What I'm basically going to cover in this seminar is how to study anatomy efficiently, right? Because when I was teaching myself anatomy, I spent a long time doing a lot of studies that didn't actually make my anatomy understanding any better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those traps, about potential pitfalls in your anatomy study, and then I'm going to give some suggestions as to how you might want to study more efficiently, and I'll do a demonstration at the end as well, like a 3D demonstration, because I don't want to draw, and then that'll be it. So we'll run for a full hour. So yeah, let's begin.
And just about questions. So if people have got questions, ask them on the chat.
Yeah.
And I'll put them to Chris.
Yeah. So basically, like, because obviously we have close to 100 people in here. So let's see if I can get to all the questions, then great. If not, Mike will decide whether your question is good enough to get forwarded, and then he'll tell me, and then I'll answer it. So where I want to start is with my favorite anatomy instructor, my favorite anatomy teacher, who's been dead a long time, was dead before I was born, but this is Paul Rocher. And any of you who've studied with me or have studied anatomy in your own time, you'll be aware of Paul Rocher's artistic anatomy. And the image that you're seeing on screen here is the kind of thing that you would expect, right? If you are studying anatomy, you would expect that what you're going to be doing is looking at images like this and doing studies from them, right? And so it cost me some pain to say this, but this is my starting point, right? This is me saying the problem with this is you are just being presented with a huge amount of information with no way of knowing how to prioritize that information. Which of these forms matters, which of the forms don't. You know, if you only had 10 hours to study anatomy, where should you put your time? How do you know whether to put it into this muscle or the face or whatever it is? And so reference books like this are amazing reference. I would always recommend Paul Rocher, but they don't teach you how to study. So that's the point of this course, or this webinar, to try and just to get you thinking about different ways that you can start to study that might speed up your learning. Mike, thanks for helping out the people who can't hear. I think for some people they need to dial in, and if you haven't dialed in, then yeah, you won't hear anything. So the question is, if this isn't the right way to study, then how should you be approaching it? You know, if you've studied in atelier, like the Barcelona Academy, for example, then you'll be familiar with knowing how to work from form. So, and this is kind of how I was studying anatomy when I was teaching myself, because, you know, I was a student at the Florence Academy of Art. So I would print these pictures out and put them on my wall and the academic students among you will recognize this whole process. I'm sizing it, I'm doing a plumb line, and then I start to just draw in my forms or whatever it is, right? I start to work out my big shapes, and then I start to build into here and start to work my smaller shapes, and then I build up and up and up until I have something that looks like this. The problem with this approach, the problem with any approach where you're just copying the thing, is that in order to copy a thing efficiently, we have all kind of techniques. Like, for example, we will flip things vertically, we will flip things horizontally, we will squint down, so that, you know, like if you're looking at the screen now, if you just squint down as tight as you can, then what you'll see is all the unimportant information disappears, and everything that's left are the big forms. So these are all techniques that we teach and we use, but the thing that these techniques all have in common is they are made to make the form abstract, right? Because a form is, you know, if you want to look at the big forms, then basically you take out all of the unimportant information. So when you're squinting, you're basically doing this. You're looking to make it more abstract, but the more abstract you make it, the less human you make it. And so this is where you have a problem, because the better you are at copying something, the less likely you are to be good at actually extracting useful information out of this. And you can try this. Like if you study at an academic institution, then maybe you do a long pose for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, for 5 weeks. Try going home and drawing that same long pose again. It is unlikely that it's going to be stuck in your head, even if you're drawing it really well, or maybe especially if you're drawing it really well, because you're abstracting the form. So if you are going to do studies like this, where you're drawing it in, you know, however it is, whatever your approach to drawing is, it doesn't have to be an academic thing, but if your starting point is that you are copying the form, right, and you're drawing in whatever, then at least once you've finished your drawing, go in and start to label it. This is super important, right? So so through here, I label whatever is important to me. So, you know, if I knew nothing about the face at all, then I might be having to go, okay, that's a mouth, and then that sticks to me, you know. But you probably know what a mouth is, so, but maybe you don't know about the orbicularis oris. So maybe you've drawn this in, but when you were drawing it, you were just thinking about it as lines. You weren't thinking about what is this thing? What does it do? What does it represent? Do we even see it in life? Why is it important? These are all questions that you need to be thinking about and that you need to ask. So as soon as you label it, right? So orbicularis oris, then I make it a thing. I step back from the abstraction, and now it's a thing. And as soon as it's a thing, I have a better chance to memorize it, right? And you know, I could try and find like other ways of remembering this. So, you know, the name of this, orbicularis oris, tells me that it orbits the mouth. That's literally what the name means. So then maybe a thing that would help me remembering that, if I draw in a mouth through here, is to just think about, I don't know, a planet orbiting around the mouth, right? And then that helps me tie in the name, it helps me remember the shape, it helps me remember the movement, and so suddenly there is a link that I have here. There is a possible way that I'm going to remember it. It's not just a collection of lines. Because if you think about it, copying something like this and hoping to learn anatomy in that way it would be something like buying a book, buying War and Peace, and going, okay, I want to be able to write like that, so I'm going to just copy out and write every word. You'll probably get better at like your handwriting because you'll have to write so many words, but you're not necessarily going to get better at storytelling. But maybe you will if you start to go in and go, well, this sentence was important to me. That stood out, and why? So it's the moment that you start to ask these questions, you start to get the information back. And so as an anatomy teacher, my whole thing is not trying to get you to remember that. That's what I used to do. I used to always just try and get students to remember, and you know, those of you who studied with me, you'll know this, whether you studied online or in person, you know, because maybe in week 3 I say to you guys, what did we do in week 2? And it's just like nothing. No one remembers, and it could be that I'm a bad teacher, it could be that you're really stupid, or it could be both of those things, or it could be neither of those things. It could just be that to absorb this amount of information, it just takes a long, long time. And so now as a teacher, I no longer see it as my job to get you to remember that information, because I can't push it into your brain. So instead, what I try and do is to help people find the questions that they want to ask. Because when you're asking the right questions, that's when you're going to start to get answers that work for you. So I want to just give a, let me undo all of this because I didn't do it on a separate layer. Okay, so here, a lot of you will be familiar with these guys, but I just want to introduce you to these concepts as other ways of looking into anatomy. So these are two authors, two very, very well-known authors in the world of anatomy teaching. Stephen Rogers Peck, who makes everything interesting and makes everything memorable. And so this way of remembering the scapula, for example, me and Mike both teach the scapula in this way, because it's such a strong visual image that it sticks. You take a spade, right, and that's where the name scapula is coming from, and you have the handle, and you break the handle, and that gives you your scapula. Once that image is stuck in your mind, it's pretty much stuck forever. And so with just like 5 minutes of study there, you can potentially get much more than the hours and hours that it would cost you to work from Recher, you know. And then here, he's just talking about, you know, the how the scapula works in relation to the humerus. This, I'm not going to go into many anatomy specifics here. As you raise your arm, what's happening is this is just the humerus moving, but at some point, this bone here called the scapula starts to join in that movement. And what he's illustrating here is that when the humerus is perpendicular, is 90 degrees to the scapula, then they move together as a unit. So this movement of the scapula is a very, very difficult thing for me to teach. When does the scapula move and when does the humerus move? And I struggled with it for a long time, because I would teach people like, okay, well, this amount of degrees is the humerus, and then after a certain amount of degrees, the scapula joins in. But now I just say, look, when the arm is up, the body of the scapula is going to be 90 degrees to that, and there you go. That's how you can figure out where it's placed. So with this one small amount of information, you can then solve this problem every time you're having it. This problem that you might battle with for years, because it's a very complex problem. So sorry, there's feedback from somewhere. Mike, could you mute your mic just for a second so I know whether it's you or not?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it's not Mike. So just as a Ernesto, thanks. Yeah. So so yeah, if you guys have your video feeds or your microphones on, please turn them off, because it's feeding back, which is super disorientating for me. Mike, you can turn your mic back on again now, because it's not doing that. Okay. So this, I'm not going to go into detail specifically with each one of these artists. I'm just wanting to introduce you to different ways of studying. And so George Bridgman, who again is a very famous artist. I'm gonna take my headset away for a minute, because I can just hear noise in the background. I wonder if I can force you to shut up.
You can if you're a moderator. Mute all in the participant list.
Mute all. Sorry, say that again.
In the participant list at the bottom, there should be a button mute all. Well, I don't know if it's there.
The participant list. Mute all. Yes. Ah, peace. I mean, that's. I mean, I would normally love to listen to all of you guys, but just this once, I'm gonna savor the sound of my own voice for another 40 minutes or something. So here I'm just giving you like a rough idea of different ways that you could approach anatomy. So here I've given you an idea of like the problems that I see with this approach, and the thing that makes Peck really strong is the strong visual imagery. Right, so there's a bunch of stuff that I teach that I have stolen directly from him, and with Bridgman, the magic here is Bridgman thinks about the body as a machine, and he has a book called The Human Machine, and this is crucial. This is again a thing that you might be missing in your anatomy study if you do it in the way that I did and you approach it just by copying. What happens is you create a parallel universe of anatomy and you never connect it to the real world. And this is a key thing that I want to focus on in the time that we have together, is how do you connect what you're studying here with the real world, rather than just learning a bunch of numbers, learning a bunch of names, and then it never really registering. And those of you who have done exams with me through my anatomy class at the Barcelona Academy, for example, will be familiar with this. Like I will teach you proportions. Let's say we have the humerus here, and we say that's 1.5 heads, right? And then we have the radius and the ulna through there, so that's going to be our ulna, our radius, and we say that's one head through there. You guys will have these numbers, these proportions drilled into you, right? Like week after week, and most of you will say, when I call out and say like, what's the proportion of the humerus? You go 1.5. What's the proportion of the ulna? 1 head, and that's great. But then when it comes to the exam, and you're drawing these bones, like I'll see like a tiny little humerus like this, and then like a really long radius and ulna like this or something like that, and then you label it, right? 1.5 heads of the humerus, and then 1 head of the radius. This is like a radius and ulna. This is a super common thing where you have a locked off world where you're going, I'm going to absorb all of that anatomy stuff. I know 1.5 heads, I know 1 head, I've memorized it all, and I even know all of the muscles on here, but you don't connect that with your actual work, right? You then do your work, and it's kind of like the wish is that somehow magically it filters through. And honestly, it doesn't. That's the frustrating thing. It doesn't magically filter through. So it means that you could spend a lifetime studying anatomy, and it never make you a better artist. That's absolutely possible. Look at a doctor, right? I mean, the average doctor who isn't an artist is not going to be able to use their anatomy knowledge in their artwork, even though their understanding will be very profound, because they haven't connected their knowledge with ways of depicting it visually. That is to say, tell stories. So this is the key thing that you want to lock into your head, whether you're an advanced student, a teacher, or it's your first day studying. You have to look at it through this lens, or at least this is my approach now, is to be thinking, how do you use this knowledge to enhance your ability to tell stories? So this is where someone like Bridgman is so powerful, because he's thinking about the body as a machine. And as soon as you're thinking about that, and you're thinking about, well, how would the arm get raised? how would he take a step forward through here? What would be involved in that movement? Then you can start to use your anatomy knowledge to be more descriptive, right? So for example, here, as the arm gets raised, if you understand that in order to lift the arm, you have to be above it, right? So this is a guy standing above the arm and lifting it up. That's the same thing that a muscle would do, right? If you want to lift a thing, you have to stand above it and pull it up. Muscles can only pull, so that's how they'll operate. So if you understand that, then you know that the tension in raising the arm is there. So you might look to tell the story of that tension. If you know that every time when you have compressed tension, you also have extension, then you know that this area is getting extended and getting pulled tight. So now you're starting to think about it in terms of what it's actually doing, and then you can think about how do you tell the story of that thing. And how you do that, well, that's up to you. This is really up to you. Like, you know, Sheila would use in his paintings, for example, different colors to represent whether it's a bony point or a fleshy point or whatever. It's his own visual language, and so this is where anatomy study becomes really powerful. But the danger is that you could lose a lot of time and not get any noticeable benefit. So I guess I've stressed that point enough. So the question is now, in your own time, whilst you're potentially unable to leave your house and you go, okay, I want to level up my anatomy study. How do I do it? And that's a very open question, of course. There's 1,000 different ways to do it. But let's talk about Ecorche, because this is a thing that a lot of people like doing and is like, I want to say fun. It could be fun. It's kind of stressful, I think, a lot of time. But a lot of people think, okay, that's the way to study anatomy, right? So then, where do you get your reference? Do you do it from photos? Do you do it from other artists? What do you do? And you can do either of those things or many more. So let's start by saying that you want to study photos. So this image is taken from Bodies in Motion. It's Scott Eaton's website of images, and he's obviously coming from an anatomy teaching point of view. So all of these images are posed and lit in a way to really accentuate that. But the thing is, even if you just start doing an Ecorche study here and just going, okay, well, let's see, that looks like that's and then you look it up in a book, okay, that's your vastus lateralis, okay, and then through here, that's going to be your biceps femoris, and that's, if you're jumping in straight like this, this is quite useful, I would say, but it's still, you're still kind of limited, and what I noticed that happens when people do this is that you will then get your reference, and typically, you know, most anatomy books will give you reference from orthographic views, from 90 degrees to the side, from at the front, from the back, from the inside, and so then people generally open their books and then just start copying the side view, and in a case like this, well, this is almost 90 degrees to the camera, this surface here. So that means that would work. But if this was twisting through space, or, you know, like his torso is here, you're not going to be able to do that. And that's good, because the key idea here, when we're wanting to learn anatomy and learn how to tell stories with the body, is that we don't get caught in copying, and that we're constantly thinking about what it is that we're depicting and how do we use whatever material we're using and whatever skill we have to tell that story better. So one exercise that I sometimes get students to do, which is in a way much easier than doing an Ecorche, is you just go around this whole work here and you just label which are the activated muscles. And in order to figure this out, you don't need much information, right? This is, so here, this is a bone, this is another bone, this is a muscle. All a muscle can do is, we have 2 points, A and B, all a muscle can do is pull one point towards another. Muscles can't push, so any movement that we might see in the body is driven by a pulling movement. So exactly like we were saying before, if you wanted to raise the arm, you couldn't push the arm up, so you'd have to pull it. So then where would that muscle be? It would have to be above the arm. So with this relatively small amount of knowledge, you could make the guess potentially that this muscle here is the one that's activated and is one that is pulling the arm up, and that would be that same muscle there on the other side. And then if you know that when this muscle is activated and creating tension or creating compression, then you're going to get extension somewhere else. And where is that extension going to be? And it's going to be on the opposite side, right? It's going to be on the underneath. So here is our extension. So this is a very simple exercise that you can do that is not going to immediately make your drawing any better or make your sculpting any better. But what it's going to do is train you to start thinking about what is actually happening in the body. And this is something that you don't need to be able to draw to do. And in your anatomy studies, you don't need to be able to draw to learn how to tell stories with the body. You just, at some point, hopefully you can mingle it with your drawing or mingle it with your sculpting or painting. But right now, it doesn't matter. That doesn't need to be a limitation to your study at all. So here, just by noticing where there's compression, where there's extension, that's information for me. And as we'll start to look at, and when we look at how other artists use anatomy in their work, we'll start to see that they're using that information all the time. And a lot of the time, they didn't have good anatomy knowledge and they didn't need it because they're just thinking about it purely in terms of story and function. So here, as we go into the foot, for example, like if we're thinking about things in terms of story, and I want you to be, as we're looking at this, right? So just take, well, maybe let's expand it, right? And look at that whole leg through here. Without necessarily needing to know about the gastrocnemius and soleus and the quad muscles or whatever it might be, just go, well, where is the extension? Where is the compression? Where am I reading bone? Where am I reading fat and muscle? And when you're doing this, what you're doing is you are turning what is just color, what is just pixels on a screen into story. And as soon as you do that, then you have material that you can use to tell a story, right? So the way that I could break this down, for example, is to say, okay, well, this foot is pointing down. And so as it's doing that, I can visibly see the compression that's happening there. So there's my compression. And compression might, one thing that you might expect to see in compressed areas are wrinkles. And then here, this is my opposite side, so this is my extension. And one thing you might expect to see in extension is the prominence of bone as all the forms get pulled tight around it, right? And so these forms get sharper, these forms get more rounded, for example. That could be a way that I look at it. And I don't need to know what muscles are involved in that process. But maybe you can start to figure it out, right? If you had to pull this foot around, where would you do that? Could you get the foot to move in that direction if you were here? And you could, only if you could push, right? Because then you could push the foot down, but muscles can't push, they can only pull. So where does that muscle have to be? It has to be here. So now as I start to annotate and to figure out where my areas of compression are, then I can know that without necessarily knowing the muscle. And the same thing for the extension. So this is just one thing that you can do without needing to know any more information than what I've just given you now, right? But let's say that you want to go in deeper and you want to start actually constructing the body. Well, one thing that you have to embrace immediately is that you can't do this without being able to construct form in some basic way, without being able to rotate form around in space and to be able to take, something like a cube, for example, and then be able to spin it in, whatever way that you want, or to take something like the rib cage would be, an egg shape, and so you can't just, this is my mistake when I was studying anatomy, is I would be studying the rib cage here as a side view, and then I'd study it as well from the front view, right? And then I'd kind of have those in my head, and I'd know, that that's 1.5 heads, and that the sternum here is made up of 2 bones and whatever, and this point here, bottom of the sternum, is 1.5 heads, and that information is all useful, but it's not going to help you here, because you need to be able to draw constructively to some degree. You need to be able to rotate forms. And this we don't have time to go into constructive drawing here, but there's a lot of information on it. If you look into how Glenn Vilppu would teach anatomy, it's purely based off of this way, so I think it's a very powerful way of doing it. Proco as well, and a lot of people. I mean, Glenn Vilppu and Proco I'd recommend very highly, but basically you need the very basics of constructive drawing before you can start doing this. And when I set Ecorche assignments to students, there is often, like, there'll be this rib cage will be rotated, and I can see someone who's really diligently worked from their recherche book and drawn the side view of the rib cage, because they just are not comfortable, like, just turning that form in space. So that's the first thing that you need to do, and as you're doing it, just okay, I'm way off there. There's the bottom of his rib cage. Okay, as you're doing this, so let's say you're starting to do this, or you're doing this as a way to learn to draw constructively. You are still going to fall into the trap of drawing stuff underneath the surface and not really connecting it. If you studied with me through the CG Masters Academy, you'll be familiar with this phenomenon in 3D, because I get you guys to build a skeleton and then to start building your musculature on top of the skeleton. And what happens is, as you start to build it, you don't connect those two. You sculpt the muscles in a way that aren't related to the skeleton. And when you're working Ecorche, this can happen all the time, that you get so concerned with the technical difficulty of, how are you going to depict these forms, that you forget to actually relate the forms. So this is a thing that you want to go back in and check, so know what it is you're looking for. So here, what do I want to look for on the rib cage? Maybe the pit of the neck. Maybe the bottom of the sternum there. Maybe the bottom of the 10th rib there. The thoracic arch, maybe something like that. So these are, I can identify these points, and you can see, like, as I've done my drawing, I've missed those points, because what's happened is the difficulty of drawing it has gotten in the way of my ability to see it. So make sure that you're seeing the form for what it is. Because if you're not connecting it with real life, then it's coming back to this problem of having 2 worlds: one world of your anatomy study and the other world of real life. But with all this stuff in mind, let's say that you are doing Ecorche and you're doing that. I would say you always want to start with the bones. There's something sexy and juicy about muscles, I know, and you kind of want to jump in with the muscles, but whenever you're working anatomically, I would say start with the bones. They set up your rhythms, they set up your proportions, they set up everything that really matters. You think, like, if you could make the bones in someone's body disappear, you'd have a pile of hot jelly on the floor. But if you could take someone's muscles all the way off their skin, you'd still recognize it as a person. So that'll give you some idea of the importance. So through here, as I'm finding the bones, it might be a real challenge for me to draw the humerus, for example, exactly with all of these little nuances, the the shape of the trochlea and the capitulum and things like this. But I don't need to. I don't need to. I just need to be able to identify where is the bone. And then through here, it's already difficult enough for me to find all these forms, right? So if I'm finding what the scapula and what the clavicle are doing, and then connecting this with my humerus, all I need to do is to figure out more or less what is happening there. The perfection of my drawing in this area doesn't matter. It's not going to help me. It'll help me in a lot of things. It'll help me become a better draftsman. It'll help me understand that bone a bit better. But really, all I want to think about is finding the bone. Because here's the thing, and this clicked with me the first time when I was doing a Michelangelo study. I was doing a sculpture from one of his sculpts, and I was going, how did he get away with knowing nothing about the accuracy of the anatomy? And I was speaking to Andrew Amaral, who now runs the Golden Gate Atelier in San Francisco. He was the anatomy teacher in the Florence Academy at the time, and he was like, well, look, the way that those guys looked at anatomy is you're just stringing meat between points, right? So if this is my pectoral muscle, and I have a rough idea about where it's going on the humerus, which is going to be about there, then I'm just stringing meat between those 2 points. And that's it. So then, like, if I was to make up another muscle completely that didn't exist, so let's say there's a muscle that starts on the rib cage and goes down there on the arm, well, I can still tell the story of what that muscle would do, because all a muscle can do is pull one point towards another. So this muscle would pull the arm towards the rib cage. Here the arm is away from the rib cage, so it would be getting stretched out. So when you're working with the muscles, you're just thinking, it's just getting stretched. It's just, the muscles are just getting, it's like string. You just pull the string between points. And the closer those points get together, like here, for example, the more compressed the muscle is. And the further away those points get together, the further away those points get from each other, the more extended it is. That's everything. That's everything. We've got another 20 minutes, but you can leave now if you want. Because then as you look into animal anatomy, well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. If you're creating concepts from your imagination, it's the same thing. You're creating a robot through here, and I want to be able to move his arm with pistons. Well, I could have a piston that goes from there to there, and a piston can only pull. So that arm would pull the arm up. It's very, very simple mechanics. And but the key thing is that you're thinking about it in this way, and you're not just thinking about copying form. So to bring this Ecorche to some point of finality, it would just be this process. You find the bones. Now, where do you find the bones? You find them at the joints. Right? So anytime when you have a joint, there you're going to have your bone. You find a way of representing the bone. So here you can see I did it as a cylinder. This again comes back to can you construct form at least in some way? You know, even like can you fake perspective to some degree? Because if you can do this, then you can start to envision the bones as cylinders or as cubes or whatever it might be, and then you can start to roll them about in space. This would take you, if you've never done it before, you spend a week just doing that. You spend a week, doing it in this way from whoever teaches it, Glenn Vilpu or Proko or whichever route you go down. And then once you have that, you can then start to find these bones, because that's all you need to really think about a bone. It's just like, a bone gets wider at each end, so you basically you just have a cylinder or box at either end, and that's as much as you need to know about it at this point. So you'll always here's another way of thinking about a bone that's not going to help you constructing it. This would be like a bone in a cartoon, like the Flintstones or something. But it's useful. It's a useful conception because it tells you that the bone gets wider at each end. So that's where you're going to find it. What's happening in the middle? Who cares? Who cares? It's buried. It's buried within the flesh. So you go to the joints and you find where the bone is going to be at the joints. And then from there, you can just find the bone by connecting those 2 points. And then once you connect those 2 points, then you can start to look at where the muscle lies on those points. And this is where you'd want to be using your anatomy reference books and going, okay, where does the biceps femoris go? Right, and then you go, well, that's going to the fibula. And so then if you've drawn in your fibulas in another place, then you go, well, then you realize that you've got that wrong, and so then that strengthens it, right? So it's this going backwards and forwards between doing the drawing and checking it and making sure that it actually lines up with what's underneath. It's going to keep on strengthening this and strengthening this. So all you need to do, find the bones, which you're going to find at the joints, and then string the muscles between them. For the rib cage, head, and pelvis, you're going to be able to find a lot of information on how to simplify those forms. And God knows you have to simplify them. For something like the pelvis, just don't try and draw the pelvis perfectly every time. Find a way to simplify it. And then work with that, and then just think, where do the muscles go to? Where are they coming from? Where are they going to? Are they stretched? Are they compressed? There's no extra level of complexity. This is about as complex as it needs to be. So let's move on from photo reference and take a look at what might happen if we're studying from other artists. And there's a lot to be said for old master study. But when it comes to studying anatomy, what you have to be sensitive to is that these guys didn't know the anatomy that well, because the information didn't exist in the collective human consciousness at the time. So here we've got Rubens, and the drawing is beautiful, but the anatomy is technically incorrect, right? I mean, in 1,000 ways. We can look at, so this will be the top of the fibula, and so then that means that the perineal muscles will be coming around the back through here, which he's kind of confused with. He's munged that in with the soleus through there. The biceps femoris is not, this line doesn't exist. This would be doing something more like that. But the point of this isn't to, for me to criticize Rubens. It's to say that all of the information that we might think is important when we're studying anatomy, we need to go, if it wasn't important, like if Rubens got it wrong and he got away with it, if Michelangelo got it wrong and he got away with it, if any of these guys, because from the 19th century onwards, this information starts to exist. It starts to become easier to learn, easier to acquire. But before then, it didn't. So I wouldn't be looking to these guys, even Da Vinci's anatomy studies. There are more accurate anatomy studies in any anatomy book that you could buy nowadays. But what's powerful about these is seeing how they were telling the stories and how they used anatomy as a storytelling device. And here we could spend the whole hour talking about how Rubens is doing this. I mean, even we can just take a foot here, right, and just go, well, the bottom of the foot is fat, and so that means when you push the weight down on it, that the fat is likely to get compressed. So he's really squishing this out through here. This is not a realistic depiction of what a heel looks like, but he's able to observe what a heel looks like. He's able to observe that the more that it carries weight, the more it's going to push out. So that's the level to which he's interested in it. And then as we get up into here, what you might see often in life is like an inward movement here. And the reason for this isn't that important. Essentially, there is a band of tendon here that comes around and it sucks the tendons and muscles inwards. But if you look at anatomy in artists who use the kind of mannered style, who like to really push things, you'll see that what they realized is that the feeling of life comes from lines that move outwards. And the concave lines don't do a whole bunch for describing a living thing. And that if you do have concave lines, when you look at it closely on a human, it's always made of convex lines that push outwards. So here we might be tempted to go make this an inward scoop, but you can see like what Rubens is hyper aware of here is that this muscle bulges out, this muscle is bulging out, and then this muscle here, which is the soleus. This is it's a muscle underneath the tendon through here. The soleus would be something like that. The soleus creates this bulge here. Now, I'm not telling you guys that because I think it's important for you to know it, but I'm telling it you because I remember when I was already teaching anatomy and I was working with my forms, I wasn't capturing this bulge because I hadn't seen it, but Rubens had. And then you look at all of the guys around that time, they'd all seen it and they all use it, even though they might not know it was a soleus muscle, because they're looking at the body and they're going, how do I tell stories with this? How do I convey tension? How do I create life? How do I create, in Rubens's case, rippling movement? Because if you look at how he's depicting men, it's all of these movements pushing outwards, outwards, outwards. So he's looking for any opportunity to tell that story. So the takeaway from this is that, like, yes, it's very useful to be doing old master study or new master, you know, from any artist that you like and admire, but it does add in another level of complications because you have to be aware that they might have screwed it up. Now, if we go to someone like Proudhon, this is much more contemporary and it's much more diligently worked from life. So the anatomy here is inevitably going to be more accurate because it's so carefully modeled on life, but the storytelling is still here. It's here, and it's in such a subtle way. So generally, where we'll see it here would be in the way that forms overlap, maybe. So, for example, the deltoid pushing in here, overlapping on top of the triceps through there, is important. If you get that line the other way around, it's a small detail, but if you get those lines inverted all over the drawing, then you're going to destroy the sense of depth, which is then going to destroy the illusion of reality, which will break your story. So even here, even when you're working very carefully, very diligently from life, having some anatomy knowledge is going to help you just to tell these stories a little bit better, right? Just the little accent through there, right, of created by that wrinkle. And when people study anatomy, they often don't think about the skin or the fat or anything other than muscle and tendon, really. But these things are still part of your body. Your body is covered in skin, almost completely covered in skin, at least. And so that becomes an important part of the story. So hitting these hard little wrinkles here is certainly important to tell about how his body is pushing forwards and how there is compression here on the front. And if there's compression on the front, that means that if we had a view on the back, there would be extension on the back. And so then if this was a sculpt, we would be looking to go, how do we tell that story from the back view? So this, something like a 19th century work would be a much easier base if you're looking to do an Ecorche over the top of a drawing. Then you're going to have an easier time with this because it's more based in something that you would expect to see rather than this. But the more it deviates from reality, the more you're going to be able to see how they use the anatomy and exaggerated it in order to tell stories. I think we have one more, so Van Dyck. So something like this. This would be like your worst case scenario for doing an Ecorche because it's so damn hard. So just to reiterate, what is the process that you are going through here? We've covered it already, right? You find the bones. So I might mark in where the top of the rib cage, it has to be here, maybe a little bit lower than that. Maybe that's the top of the rib cage. The base of my rib cage is going to be here, something like that. There's the center line. So then my rib cage has to be doing something like this, pushing out much more through there. And you may need to revisit this several times as you start to flesh in other forms and other movements. But the idea is you're starting with finding the bones. So now I start to find my scapulas. Can I connect that to my clavicles through here? But at this point, I'm learning something by trying to find the bones. But if I start to label this, scapula swings out. Scapula swings out because his arm is going forward. As soon as I've done that, as soon as I've connected those two things, then it means that when I'm working with an arm that's getting pushed forward, I'm thinking about telling the story here. That for me to be thinking about that is much more powerful than just drawing in the muscles. But of course, if you want to, we then go ahead and we draw in the muscles, but always thinking about where is that muscle starting, where is that muscle finishing? Is it compressed? Is it extended? Through here, sorry, I've just noticed this, it's a bit of a tangent, but for those of you who've studied with me, when I'm teaching you the wrists, I might go, just think about the wrist as a box, because ultimately most of these muscles turn to tendon down here. So the shape of the wrist is just bone, and the shape of the radius and the ulna together gives you pretty much a box shape. And so just noticing that is very useful for me to go like, yeah, that's what Van Dyck did. He just went, there's a box. But interestingly, here, this is just what I'm taking away from it now, is he's allowing that box to push outward slightly, and that's because of the muscles on the thumb. And then I look to see what he's doing on the other side, and he's bending the box again. This is just for me. So at this point, you know, having taught anatomy for so many years, by not mindlessly copying it and by being conscious of what I'm looking for here and looking at here, I'm able to steal. I'm able to take more. And one thing that I'll say to students sometimes is, you know, they're stood in front of a model for 3 to 6 to 8 hours a day. If I'm spending that same time in front of a model, if I'm being mindful of what I'm looking at, if I'm asking the right questions, then I'm going to be able to start to steal much more information than they will. So my 3 hours become more productive than their 3 hours, because I'm constantly looking for how is the story being told here? What is this doing? How is the tension being conveyed there? But this doesn't require years and years to do. You can be doing it now, and you should be training this this mindset now. I've just realized that anyone who came late wasn't allowed into the meeting. So all of you guys who've just come to the webinar now, apologies, I didn't realize that you were locked out of the room. And I guess this would be the same for anyone who accidentally dropped out of the session. We are almost at the full hour. What I'm going to do now is just see if I've missed any questions. I think Mike, I probably muted you when I muted everyone. So apologies for that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So Megan's asked, what would be a good daily practice to learn anatomy? At the moment, she's been doing anatomy studies part by part, where she has been sculpting. Yeah. So what would you recommend?
Well, I think to get any of these things to start to stick in your head, hang on, I'll just let Robert know. Everyone else can hear me, right? It's just Robert. Could someone let Robert know that he has to dial in? So if I need a thing to stick, it's going to be based off of repetition, right? So let's go. Let's go here, because this is a form that I'm unfamiliar with, right? I'm familiar with because because it's Rubens's made up form. So let's say that this is the anatomy that I want to memorize. I'm not necessarily going to be able to memorize it by just repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. I need to find a way of consciously leveling myself up each time. And in order to do this, I need to not have the reference, because it's like, for me, I think about this as like when you're learning a language, and maybe someone's speaking it and you can kind of understand it, or you're reading it and you can understand it, and so you think, I know that language, and then you try and speak it and the words just don't come, and you can't find them and you can't put them together. And so with anatomy, you need to know that you can speak it. So what I would be doing is I'm looking at this form and I'm trying to internalize it, right? I'm trying to go, okay, he pushes out at the front and then it's pretty flat on the back. It's divided, he's dividing it right in the middle, okay. And then this stuff I don't think I can get for now. So that's maybe it. That's maybe all I'm going to be able to absorb for now. So here I'm trying to remember what that, so pushing out on the front, and it's really important that you give language to this so that you can think about the character that you're trying to capture. So pushes out at the front, and then it's relatively straight on the back. Okay, and then it's divided kind of halfway. I'm just gonna mute everyone again. Okay, and then I'm saying it's divided halfway, something like that, right? So then there's a division there, and then I can't quite remember what he's doing. That there's some there's some kind of tendon that's coming through there. He has something else dropping off through there. I remember this where this would be where the great trochanter is. It's feeling kind of fatty. There's something weird about that shape, and then his gluteus maximus is kind of doing what I expect it to do, right? Something like that. So let's say this is my first attempt at trying to memorize what that form is. And so then I look at it and I go, what did I get right? What did I get wrong about it? Well, I mean, the big thing is I just, I missed his big inclination, right? That's really leaning back. So then I go, okay, that's the one thing that I want to capture next time. And then what else could I potentially get? Maybe I want to start understanding here. So I'm saying this is like one point that kind of breaks off into three. Just to reiterate, guys, this is not correct anatomy. This is why I'm using this as an example, so that I'm learning new forms. So one form that breaks into three. So I'm going to call that the fork of the middle of the leg. Okay. So now I go again. So here, what do I need to be aware of? Big angle that pushes back, okay? So I need to make sure I don't miss that. I still have this with it's pushing out to the front. It's relatively flat at the back. It's divided in half. I think the fatty blob stuff was kind of right. The gluteus had a steeper movement. And then here, okay, here's my fork. So 1, 2, and then this third one dips out from under there. And then here, this feeds through into the patella. That's kind of like I was expecting. And then whatever, something else is potentially happening at the back there. So this is my second iteration. So basically, each time what you're doing is you're iterating. You're seeing what went right, what went wrong, and then you repeat it again. So here, maybe thinking about the inclination there, doesn't matter. But it might take 10, 20 iterations of this before I can create that. But ultimately what you're doing is you are creating a process that is custom made for your own weaknesses, right? It's made to be efficient for you, because the mistakes that you are making are going to be different to the mistakes that other people are making. So it becomes a very mindful approach. And when I was studying animal anatomy, for example, I would in my lunch break be kind of going, Okay, well, let's see. So, and I remember these thoughts still. Like, so here's my scapula, and the scapula is long compared to a human scapula, and then it here where it articulates with the bone, it's like here's my eye, right? It's like and there's a tongue. It's like a mouth sucking on the bone. So that's that's in my head, and it's in my head forever. And then here the shoulder was really pushing forwards. I remember that, and then it has this very strong S curve, something like this. And then like all bones, it's getting really wide at the ends. And then as I'm starting to work the muscles, it's just the same thing. I'm just thinking about where are these muscles coming from? What are they going to? But also, is there any way that I can get the shapes to stick in my head? So this idea of the bone sucking on the other bone, that might be a thing that works for you guys. It might be a thing that someone's already noticed before in a book. I don't know, but that was the thing that worked for me. So I'm custom building a way of learning that works for me, because the thing that is a strong visual image for me might not be a strong visual image for you. So instead of relying on all of this reference that you have, which is super useful to have, but you can start to make it for yourself. Okay, so Mike, could you let me know if there's any more questions? And
yeah, just on that, Chris. So if that's overdrawing and finding the shapes that you see and practicing that, is there a way to do that with sculpting?
Yeah, the exact same thing. The exact same thing. The only thing with sculpting is it takes you a little while. Takes you a little while longer. If you're doing it digitally, need to clear the screen here. So someone's figured out a way to draw on the screen. Clear all drawings. Okay. Yeah, with sculpture it's the same thing, whether it's digital or traditional. The only thing is it just takes you a little bit longer. So even if you're someone who like, let's say, self-identifies as a non-draftsman and you don't like drawing, just shut up and draw, because it's just like, because the drawing doesn't need to be good, right? I haven't done a single good drawing in this whole session, but if I was wanting to learn, it would be enough. It would be enough for the forms to kind of stick in my head. And with sculpture, it just takes you longer to do it, but it helps you learn the form in 3 dimensions. So I guess you can look at this from both sides, because if you're a sculptor saying, I don't want to draw, then you should shut up and draw. And if you're a draftsman or a painter saying like, well, I don't want to sculpt, then of course you shut up and sculpt, because then you can start to understand the 3-dimensionality of the form, which, if you want to construct the form, then you need to know. So for example, here, this is me constructing a rib cage, and those, I'm going to just need to mute everyone again. People who have studied with me in CGMA, for example, will be familiar that pretty much every week we have live sessions, very similar to this one, and I will be sculpting a rib cage as we're talking about whatever. So it does mean that I sculpt on average about 1 rib cage a week, something like that. And so but each time I do it, if I can, each time I'm doing it, I'm like, how can I be more efficient? How can I be more accurate? How can I just get straight to the point with more ease? So if you're looking at this in an anatomy book, there might be an overwhelming amount of information, because you have all of the ribs through there, and you need to know how to strip that down to what matters to you. So this is going to be like the egg shape of it. It's going to be the opening through here. It's going to be the plane break that you'll have through there, for example, and then it will be the exact same with the clavicle and the scapula and whatever it is. You just, you do it, and you do it as quickly and mindfully as you can. So you're not just throwing form together, you're consciously thinking about, what is it that I'm trying to hit this time? So with the clavicles, are you hitting that S curve that you need to hit? Are you understanding the relationship of the clavicles with the scapula, right? How they connect through here, what the acromion process is doing, and where that touches the clavicle. And if you're struggling with it, then you just keep on you keep on doing it until you start to nail it. Of course, like if you just can't see what's wrong with it, that's a more difficult problem. But that's where you might want to get a teacher. I know that we're over time here, but I'm happy to just push this further forward. Like now I'm sculpting, so I'm happy anyway. And so yeah, if you have any more questions, then I can field them, and maybe in relation to what I'm doing here.
And Chris, just on the sculpting and drawing, is it one better than the other, or is it a mixture between the two of sculpting and drawing that's going to improve your knowledge?
Yeah, it's well, like I say, with the drawing, with the drawing, we need to define what we're talking about when we talk about drawing, right? Because good drawing is dependent on a lot of factors, and it takes a long time to learn. But drawing as a tool to help you understand the thing better, that's completely separate, right? You don't need to know how to draw to use it as a tool. So I would say generally that I would really recommend against drawing a distinction between like those who draw and those who sculpt. It's like you want to do whatever is the best thing for telling the story, and whatever is the most efficient way of doing that. And so if that's drawing, that's drawing, and if it's sculpture, then it's sculpture. But I do feel that once you start to try and make a conscious effort, let's say, as you start to make a conscious effort to push towards one or the other, it becomes a false thing. It's like you're putting these two things in opposition. And maybe a way in which I can illustrate how these things are more or less one and the same. You know, my first sculpting instructor at the Florence Academy of Art, or who was at the time the head instructor at the Florence Academy of Art, was Robert Bodem, and he has a book. I believe you can buy his book. I'm not sure. At the time, it was only available to students, but it's called Drawing in Space, and that kind of summarizes it, right? I think it's a really elegant way of looking at that, because all you're doing is you're saying, well, potentially this is one and the same thing. It's just one has one more dimension than the other, right? One is 2D, one is 3D. But so what you would be encouraged to do a lot at the Florence Academy, or at least under Rob, would be drawing on your work, and we also push this quite a lot at the Barcelona Academy. So for example, say I want to start to figure out, like maybe I'm losing control over my forms through here, and I want to just work out what I'm doing. Well, if you're working in clay, don't underestimate the power of a steak knife, you know, just for drawing in form. It's a very powerful sculpting tool. So here I can now start to work my forms, and the advantage of this, the advantage of working this way, is that it doesn't take me much time to put in a mark and to know, you know, whether or not that mark is in the right place. And this is, especially when you're working from reference, it's very, very powerful, because you know, if you're using techniques like, let's say, academic techniques working from reference, you might use a lot of horizontal or vertical lines to compare what lines up to what, right? So here, what I would teach is the border of the scapula, which is there, lines up more or less with the border of this mass here, which is the lumbar mass. And just by drawing in a line and drawing in a line, it becomes very easy for me to see whether or not that makes sense, right? It becomes very easy for me to see if the scapula is too long as soon as I get a little bit more information in there. And there's basically, like, distance is a difficult thing to judge without information. So let's say you're working from a model and you're trying to gauge this distance. You basically have this and this as your extremes, so they become your reference points. But as soon as I put in a mark here, now I kind of I can judge that distance, and then I can judge that distance, and maybe that one, and that one. So now I have many more things that I can use to check to know whether my work is accurate. Now, this doesn't make sense to you guys, maybe because I don't have the reference up. But if I did, and this is a good opportunity for me to talk about 3D scans as reference. Now, those of you who work digitally will be familiar with this, I'm sure. I get most of my scans from a place called 3D Scan Store. But even if you're not involved in the digital world, the guys who take these scans, so these are all scans of people, they're all very, very accurate. They have an app called Anatomy 360, which is basically, you don't need like this expensive software then to view the sculpts. You can view it there. You can look at, you can change the lighting and things like that. And this scans are very underused, I think, anatomy study resource, because you have the information in 3 dimensions, and it's based off of real life. There are limitations to it. There's no guiding principle. There's no simplification. There's no way of knowing what's important. But the utility of it is second only to studying from real people in real life. And maybe you don't have access to a life model. And if you don't, or you don't have access to a life drawing or life sculpting class, then please look into scans as a way of being able to study form in 3 dimensions. So let's say that let's start to adapt my sculpt to be something more like this guy. So now what I'm going to do, and this I'm kind of hoping I can loop this back into the drawing versus sculpting question. As I draw in this point, it would take me longer to sculpt it. So I'm just going to make the mark, just going to make a note, and then I'm going to draw a horizontal. And you can do this physically. I do it in my eye, and I'm going, okay, that's lining up with like the tops of my scapulas there, for example. Whereas here, as I draw a horizontal, my scapulas are significantly below that point. So just by having that information in there, I can then use it to start to check off against other things. And so even if you're not drawing on paper, if you're not drawing 2D, drawing on your sculpt is a way that allows you to mark things in very quickly. So if we look at this with the Rectus Abdominus, for example, I'm going to start this drawing, right? Like I know that the abs are half the width of the body. That's my rule anyway. And then I know they're going to be divided here. Then the top one's going to angle down and be kind of thin. Second one kind of more square. And then this has the opposing angle, and bonk, that meets the belly button there. If that's wrong, then I'm going to know about it as soon as I've made the marks. So I don't have to worry about spending however much time sculpting it. And then if I decide that it's right, then I can start to work into this more and start to sculpt into this more. Ben, I've just seen your comment that Robert teaches on the new Masters Academy. I didn't know that, so I would recommend anyone checking out Robert Bodum's sculpting and his teaching as well. He was my first sculpting instructor, and very much influenced a lot of how I sculpt. Not completely, because he told me not to study anatomy, but in many other ways. But his the reason why he told me not to study anatomy, this is an important point that we should mention here, is that the disaster for anyone as an anatomy student is that they start to make anatomical work, right? Anatomical drawings, anatomical sculpts, whatever it is, and that really is a disaster, because it doesn't want to look anatomical; it wants to look naturalistic. So one thing to be aware of here is just this trap that's kind of the jaws are waiting for you, and you're going to fall into it, because you spend the time studying these forms and like the whole process that we've just gone through, of memorizing a form. Let's say you go through that, and from that process you learn about the obliques, and they're doing that, and it's like, well, you worked for that knowledge, right? You worked hard for that knowledge, and then now that I'm using it, it looks ridiculous in my sculpt. And the thing is, because the obliques, if you were to peel off the skin and the fat and everything else, then yes, the obliques would look like that. But once you take everything else into account, the obliques no longer look like that. And Ben, I realized after our CGMA session the other day, you were asking about how to make a thing feel naturalistic. And I can't remember what I said. But afterwards, I thought I had a much better answer. And this kind of ties in with what I'm talking about now. Naturalism comes from an appreciation of the complexity of the body, but complexity should be built through simplicity, because everything is so complex. You can't internalize what a body looks like. That's not, it's just infinitely complex. And those of you who've done a long pose will start to be sympathetic to this, because you spend 6 weeks on a drawing, and all that happens at the end is you realize how much more complex it was, how much more stuff you didn't get. So what you need to do is find that complexity through simplicity, and that's something that Ecorche doesn't necessarily, at least Ecorche drawing doesn't get you, because then you maybe get an affinity for these oblique muscles, for example, right? And so then because that's what you're seeing, right? When you open up your Recherche book, that's what you see, so that's what you take. But actually, what is happening here in just this area here? Well, you have the ribs. So if we were to peel off the muscle, we'd see the ribs moving in that direction. Now, that's not a complex idea, right? Just ribs moving from back to front. They have a downwards angle, so that's maybe a tiny bit more complex, but let's say that's not too complex that you can't understand it. So then, okay, great, you have your ribs, but then they transition to cartilage. So the arch through here, the skeletal arch, or the thoracic arch, is cartilage. So let's take away his abs again, and start to find the cartilage through here. And this is just like a line, but it's kind of wavy. So that's not too difficult either, right? It's a line, kind of wavy, something like that. And then this is giving us most of what we need to depict the rib cage, right? The big shape of the rib cage is like an egg, so I'm just starting to refine that egg shape, but that's all we need from the rib cage. But then the abdominals, the rectus abdominis here, lays on top of the rib cage. So this shape is like kind of like a Lego brick. That's not too complex either, right? But it's laying on top of this form here. So what you see a lot of time will be like a diagonal movement cutting through here. And so then what we have is our rectangular form with a diagonal cutting through it. It's starting to get complex. But the idea of that and the idea of that are not complex. So, when you're feeling like anatomy is overwhelming, just remember the only thing that matters is the simplicity of the thing. And the only thing that's going to make a real difference between someone using the anatomy really well and someone not is how well they work with the simple forms. It's not the fact that I can tell you about the plantaris muscle and maybe you never heard about the plantaris muscle doesn't make me a better artist than you. Doesn't make me a better artist even using anatomy. It's just a bit of information. But if you can start to tell stories through layering of form, complexity of form, then you're going to be able to get stuff that doesn't feel anatomical. So to come back here, like, yeah, we have the obliques. The obliques exist. Let's find them and let's acknowledge them. But they're layering over top of the ribs, right? And then through here, this muscle is called the serratus. This is thicker, more noticeable. So I don't want the ribs pushing through here. I just want to find the read of that muscle. So now, just in this area, we are starting to get a feeling of complexity. We're starting to get a feeling of naturalism, but there's no one concept here that's particularly difficult, right? It's just layering of form. The back, like, everyone struggles with the back, but it's for the same reason, right? You need to know. So, for example, like, here's the line of the rib cage. So we have that, and then these muscles here, they're incredibly complex, but in life they just kind of look like that. They don't on him, so I'm not going to reference him for that. You can take my word for it. And then here we have some muscles. It's like the rhomboid muscles coming here. So this is like, if we look at this area, it's going to seem really, really, really complex, but it doesn't have to be, right? Let's bring all of this down and go, here's our scapula. Just 2 lines, right? The full scapula is going to be something like that. Doesn't matter. All we see in life is 2 lines. You see on him, bonk, 1 line, 2 lines. So that's all I'm interested in. That's all I'm looking for now. It's just, we just hit these 2 lines, and then that gives me my scapula. Okay, and then what? Well, this form here, this is going to be the form of the rhomboids, goes towards the spine off of this line. So then that's a secondary thing, and then this silhouette of the shoulders through there is created by the trapezius laying on top of that. So at the moment, it's really just 1, 2, 3 planes. And then we go, there's a sausage form down here. There's a kind of egg-shaped form there. And then here, the trapezius, if I draw this in, the trapezius is doing this. And so what starts to happen now, as soon as I layer that on top, is complexity, because this is our scapula. This is the trapezius over the top of the scapula. So here it's covering the scapula, but here it isn't. So that means that we get the form to be more soft here and more hard there. You see it on him, softer, harder. Here, the trapezius turns to tendon, so the movement is more abrupt. So in my head, right, what's happening when I'm thinking about the trapezius is I'm going, it's a kite shape, right? There's our kite. That's what I'm thinking of there. That's my most simple conception of that form. And then I go, it turns to tendon here and here. And I say, when someone is muscular, the transition of a muscle to tendon can be very noticeable. So then I internalize that. So far, we've just got 3 things internalized. 1, the big shape. 2, the turning to tendon. And that's it for now. And then maybe I start to go, okay, this top line, this top section I can break into 1, 2, 3 lines. This bottom section, 1, 2, 3 lines. So I start to layer on that knowledge bit by bit. But to start with, I only maybe need the shape of the kite, and that maybe gets me something. So the idea is really like I'm just prioritizing the form based off of how it manifests itself in life, and based off of how much I'm able to absorb. And this is a constant battle for me as a teacher, because I know that as I'm starting to break this form down, I can see it. When I'm teaching in front of a class of students, I can see the eyes rolling back into the head as I start to get into the real complexity of the thing. And I kind of want to go, it's okay, because the complexity is just layered simplicity. It's like a Hemingway book, right? Like he isn't using any words that are like more than 3 syllables long, but the movements of the characters in the story are so rich and so complex. But there's no single word there that's like a difficult thing to understand. And anatomy is very much the same thing. It's very much the same thing, because you need to have enough of these basic tools that you can start to tell stories. And it doesn't need to be much. You don't need to be an anatomy teacher. You don't need to have studied it for 10 years or whatever. And this is the whole idea that I'm trying to drill into you guys here. Is just like, if you can find that way to make it make sense for you specifically, then that's going to be the fastest way that you can learn. To just think about how you can memorize form, and how you can start to use these forms to tell stories. and that's why I was talking about the drawing, where you sketch a bit, not looking at the reference, and then you bring the reference back, because what's happening is you're starting to cultivate a learning program that's made just for you. Anyway, I digress. So any other questions, let me know. I'm sure we're over half an hour over here, but a lot of you are still here.
There was a question about what's the best way to approach drawing anatomy without a life model from imagination, but I think you've gone over it there. But maybe it's worth repeating. And how to give something that's from imagination, how to give it life.
Okay, yeah, those are actually two good questions. The first one, I guess we covered a little bit, because there are a bunch of apps. I wish I could remember the name of them, because I don't use them myself, and it's really important that when you're working from reference that it's good reference. Like if you're working from an anatomy book and the drawings are kind of crappy, that might throw you out immediately. So I mean, I know Proco has his Skelly app, which is great, but it doesn't have any muscles in. So generally, I would say if you don't have access to anatomy model, then something like Anatomy 360, any ability to actually look at stuff in space, I think is a really, really useful skill. I'm just trying to think if there's anything that I'm missing that I would flesh out. Well, I mean, in terms of books, Paul Roche's book, I know I started this class with a red cross through Paul Roche, and that's not to say that I don't think that his book is the best book on anatomy, because it is, and it's not to say that I don't think that that's one of the best ways to learn anatomy is through him, because it is. But you need other supplementary books, and I would say Stephen Rogers Peck and Bridgman, they have different approaches, and Goldfinger, because he uses photo reference and shows you where everything is in the photos. So I would recommend those. And what I did, and again, this is the same mistake that I've been talking about from the start when I was a student, is I had those books and I did drawings from the books, copying them. And you want to do studies from the books, but you don't want to copy. So this is the key thing. Just the key thing, whatever reference you're getting your hands on, however it is you're doing it, is just remind yourself that you are constructing and not copying. Like the skill of copying is a very, very powerful skill as a visual artist, but I don't see that it's connected to studying anatomy. I see it as a separate thing. So, yeah, whatever reference you can get your hands on, whether that's 3D scans, whether it's photo reference, like in Bodies in Motion, Scott Eaton's website, whatever it is, just make sure you're constructing and not copying. And also don't forget that you have a body. It's a really important thing. You definitely have a body. You can take a look at it now, and you can, if you're sat down watching this, you can feel like the outside of your knee there, and you can feel that it's going to be bony because joints are bone, like we spoke about before. And so that's going to be your femur pushing out. It's, we always think about anatomy study as being this guy, right? But this person is just as human, and we need to know how the building blocks are the same, whether it's that guy or this person or this person. It's very difficult to find an anatomy book that covers fat storage, but how is it less anatomical than bone or muscle? How is it less part of the body? Even on a person who carries less fat than she does, what's the average percentage body fat on an adult? The 28, 33%, something like that, and yet we don't study it. So just working from life whenever you can. This also ties in with what we were talking about with making things naturalistic as well. You can't do that if you're not working from life. Mike, I feel like there was a second question there that I can't remember what it was, so I don't know if I've answered it.
Sorry, yeah, it's how to make something look lifelike if you're not drawing from life.
Right, you can't, you can't. You're screwed. Well, the thing is like what you need to do to build up a visual library, right? So for example, let's say I'm looking at this guy, and this guy is my reference point, and I go, okay, I'm going to study this area on him, right? So here, oops. So here, without looking at him, this is how I'm conceiving of the area. And so then what I want to look for is kind of like, what am I missing? And so there's an interesting movement here, right? Because I'll always look for this triangle, which you can see on him. But okay, there's two interesting things that are happening here. There is, or interesting to me anyway, there is this depression here, but then this is pushing out like a diamond. And as I'm looking at that, I'm going, I'm sure I've seen that before. I'm sure that's a thing that pectoralis muscles do on some people. Like, and if they do, that's really useful because then that stops me just making like this one boring horizontal line. It allows me to give that line a little bit of movement. But so the point is here, I've never noticed that before. But now I've looked at it and I've labeled it and I've taken it. You know, this is the diamond, the pec diamond, right? And now I'm linking it. I'm linking it to here, to the diamond of the trapezius. And this is a new sensation that I'm having now here with you guys, and I'm confident that it'll stick. The point is that this is now assimilated to some degree in my visual library. If I don't use it, it'll disappear in the same way as, you know, if you don't speak a language, if you don't use the words, they will disappear. But this is now part of my visual library, so that if I'm working without the model, and I'm going, how can I start to push the naturalism here? I can dig that out of my visual library. And what this is, and you know, a lot of you guys will be familiar with me talking about this idea. This is an unexpected detail. An unexpected detail is what I call something that you don't see in an anatomy book, right? In Richer, we see something like that. Maybe if I look closely, he'll actually have discovered this, but generally we're thinking about the pecs as this shape, right? And you know, we will have all of our conceptions for whatever we see, and we need to simplify the forms to learn them. So of course we need to internalize these simplified forms, but what we gain from studying from life is that there is always some chaos in the mix. There's always something weird and unexpected. And so what I'm consciously doing when I see these things in life is I take them. So I take them and I add them to my visual library. So then essentially, to make a thing feel naturalistic without reference, if you don't have a sufficiently large visual library, you can't. You can't do it. Nature is everything. You always have to go back to nature. But what you're doing is not copying. You are going back and you are stealing from nature, right? You are taking from nature so that then you can use that to tell stories. It's not you don't want nature to be a trap, right? You are taking what you want from it, and then you might use that to tell stories in different ways. So yeah, short answer is just you can't, and you'll die trying. And you see this all the time. You know, when people are not working from reference enough, it's a key thing. You know, for me, like, you know, I work in film in the entertainment industry. We generally are working to pretty tight deadlines, meaning that we just don't have so much time to just sit and look and find all of these weird, unexpected movements. And so that's why generally our sculpts don't look as nice as like what you would see put out of the ateliers, because there people do. We get away with it because, like, you know, our sculpts are blown across the screen, blurred at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But yeah, generally that they lack that sophistication because we don't have that time to take from nature, which is again why I'm building up a visual library, because then if I have to do something that looks like it could be naturalistic within 15 minutes, then at least I have the library to do that. Okay, anything else?
I just got one question. That seems to be the end of the questions from the people in the group. But if you were going to show, how would you represent bone, muscle, and fat? Is there any tips you'd give on how you'd show that in a sculpt or a drawing?
Well,
or what's the character you're looking for in them?
Yeah. Well, this is where it starts to become what visual language do you use to express those things. So let's just pose this guy so that we can talk about that. So we'll lift his arm up, something like this, and then we'll dip him to one side. Something like this. So I'm doing this just so that we are starting to expand on the characteristics, the visual, the characteristics of like muscle becomes more muscly, let's say, as it gets compressed, it gets more rounded. So so here, what I've done by doing this, and I hate the fact that he's feeling off balance now, so I'm just gonna fake this and bring him into some sort of alignment. So yeah, what's happening here is the same things that we've spoken about before, right? We now have compression on this side, and we have extension happening on this side. So Mike's question as to, well, you know, what are the characteristics that I'm looking for in muscle, tendon, fat, bone, whatever it is? Well, that's kind of related in a way to what it's doing. So I'm consciously thinking about what is the material property of that thing. So with bone, for example, it's hard. And so here, what's happening is the bone is pushing out onto the surface, and so I'm feeling that hardness as it's, you know, it's like you're taking a sharp implement and pushing it through cloth. You're going to start to feel that pushing out on that side. So what I want to convey here is the sharpness of the bone pushing out there, and the straightness of the muscle, because it's getting pulled tight through here. So in this way, when I'm thinking about muscle, I'm thinking about straightness, but only because it's extended. And then on this side, I'm thinking about roundedness, because everything down here is getting compressed, right? So through here, so we start to get these wrinkles forming. Like the accuracy of the anatomy doesn't matter at all, right? All that I need to be able to do is to hit the story beat. The story beat is that this form is rounded because it's muscle and fat pushing out, and so that creates wrinkles. My own what's the word I'm looking for? Like reference point or shortcut, I suppose, for this is I go, okay, if a form is compressed, I don't look for the muscle. It's weird because you think if the muscle is tense, then you go, okay, let's look to really, you know, describe the tension of that muscle. But as the muscle gets compressed, the skin gets compressed, the fat gets compressed. So what I'm looking to do is to say where there is tension through here, I'm not looking for definition. And where there is extension, I'm looking for the bone pushing out. And that, as the muscle gets pulled straight, is maybe where I find the muscle. But this might vary from person to person. So, at the Barcelona Academy, we're lucky to have Ecorche teaching there, whose sculpts are not anatomically based, but tell story in a very powerful and clean and functional way, right? And what you'll see if you look at his work, Mike, could you type his name out for anyone who doesn't know him, because I think he's a great reference point. It is like you'll see him using marks on his work that don't necessarily relate to anatomical form. And then what I noticed with our students at the school is I started seeing these marks kind of creep in, and people looking for like kind of Ecorche sort of movements. But what was often missing is like his marks are not there to look cool. They are there to tell a story in a way that doesn't have to be anatomical, but he will be identifying the tension in this area. And so those marks might be used to describe the tension. And so what he's doing is using a different visual language. Like, so what I've been talking about here is using the visual language of trying to represent that naturalistically, but you don't have to do that. And if you look at any artist, especially any artist who has a noticeable style, what you will see is that style is ultimately a visual language, is ultimately a collection of rules for how do we describe things. So in this case, for example, I could say that, well, when we find bone, what I do is I make it razor sharp. That's not how you see it. It's not how you see it in life, but that might be a rule that I use to really make the boniness feel bony. So there is not ever going to be a correct way of doing this. It's more like be conscious of what it is that you're looking to describe and think about how do you want to describe that. So here, as the arm gets raised, here's compression, here's extension. I could just say a really simple rule. When areas are extended, they're straight. So a straight line will convey that tension. Who cares about the anatomy of the thing? Right here, roundedness will convey the compression. If you look at Rubens, Rubens is maybe an extreme example, but Raphael being a more restrained example, if he has tension, it's eggs. So we don't worry about the exact anatomy of it, but egg shapes will help convey the tension that's happening through here. So that becomes a rule. And if you look at Rubens' more extreme work, then when he's depicting tension, it's just egg on egg on egg on egg, and you can't ever connect it necessarily with that's the palmaris longus muscle or whatever. It's just there's just tension in that area. Sergio, I've just seen your question about teaching other anatomy online courses. Now, at the moment, I have my class at the CG Masters Academy, which is all a digital class. I'm developing a course with Proco, which is kind of everything we've been talking about here, but as a huge, never-ending course, or it's never-ending for me as I'm building it. But hopefully this year we'll be able to get that out. So that's kind of like a storytelling approach to anatomy, and I'm building one for flip normals as well. And those of you who are working in entertainment will probably be familiar with those guys. But at the moment, that's it. That's as much as I have time for. But thank you guys for sticking around, and I hope that you feel like you got something out of it. It was a lot of fun for me to do, and we might do more of them. Who knows? But let's call it there for now.